The topic for today is building a tenant satisfaction measures improvement roadmap. And I would like to give an extremely warm welcome and a big truckload of thanks to Jonathan Cox, Head of Data and BI at Housemark. Jonathan's worked in the housing sector for over 20 years, though you wouldn't believe it looking at him. He has helped countless housing providers improve performance, achieve value for money. He's their data and research head at the moment, and he oversees a range of high-profile projects, the STAR framework work that they've done, and monthly impact monitoring, and the COVID-19 pandemic, all kinds of great projects there. He's here today because Jonathan and I are speaking next week at Housing 24. And in a call kind of a few days ago when we were planning that, he started saying some really interesting things that Housemark have been doing. I reached out to him afterwards saying, that sounded really good. I know it's ridiculous notice, but would you come on our webinar and share some of that? And to my absolute surprise, Jonathan agreed. He was really busy. And so he got up really early this morning to do his slides as well. So I cannot tell you how lucky we are to get him and how happy I am that he's made that effort. Jonathan, thank you so much. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you, and I'll go through what you're going to be talking about for everybody's benefit in a moment. Also, big thank you to somebody who is hopefully familiar to a few of you now, Helen, our head of account management. Helen basically heads up our work with residential and commercial housing people. She's been in the sector now a few years. Knows it inside out, back to front, and is going to be leaving us very soon to go on maternity leave, which is something that fills me with absolute dread because none of us have a clue when she's not here. So she went on holiday a few weeks ago. It was hell. So God knows how we're going to survive, but we're very excited for you, Helen, and thank you very much for turning up. So, and I'm Pete. I'm CEO of Wordnerds, and I'm the bumbling idiot that doesn't know anything but asks all the questions. So what we're going to be going through today, Jonathan's going to start us off looking at some of the work that Housemark have been doing around understanding and acting on TSM results. They've been doing a lot of comparative work, looking at how everybody's getting on this year compared to last year and other years. He's got some great stats, some good learning. He's going to introduce us to the ostrich. I have frankly no idea, and I'm a little bit terrified about how he's going to stretch a metaphor of an ostrich to match a webinar about tenant satisfaction measures. But if anybody can, Jonathan can. So we believe Jonathan, and we're looking forward to that, however contrived it may be. And then he's going to go into what learning we can get from I think some of the best people that are operating in the sector and some of the areas where numbers are going in the right direction and people are doing the right things. So loads of learning there. Once we're finished with that, Helen's going to pick up how we turn all of this learning into building your roadmap for improvement. We've got a few slides there to go through. I may well wade in a bit later on some statistical analysis stuff because that's how interesting I am. And then we're going to jump over to Q&A and get your questions and hopefully leave plenty of time for discussion at the end. To wit, you will see a chat function in Zoom. Please use it. I promise you this works much better as dialogue than monologue. Please chip in with questions at any stage. We'll try and pick them up as we're going. If not, we'll definitely pick them up at the end. We're always surprised and delighted by how many of you turn up to these things, but also how enthusiastically you participate. And do beware, when people ask particularly challenging or interesting questions, we often point the finger at them and get them to come up and give us more detail and ask them themselves. So we may well get you up on stage, so to speak, if that is okay, and nobody has to. That's cool. So that's the preamble. Obviously, unless you've been living under a rock for a long time, you will know that we're kind of there for TSMs now. The deadline of 30th of June is upon us. Most people we've spoken to have been home and host for a while. They've got their sort of submission in, which is great. There's already learning that we've had from the regulator and other people. It looks like this time the regulator cares more about compliance than the actual results. I think that's fair enough. And as time goes on, they will care more about seeing RPs improve. We've already seen that there's a potential that exceptionally positive results may garner extra scrutiny. So people are being encouraged to submit everything, warts and all, and be transparent and adopt a learning mindset to these things, which is, I think, a great approach. There's already some skepticism about collection methods. So, asking people questions in the height of a warm summer is very different from monsoon season that we had all the way through spring. Similarly, we know that if you ring people up and speak to them when they haven't seen you for a while, they're unlikely to say the kind of negative criticism that if they will tell you if they've just had a problem and they're behind a keyboard. So the differences between phone and online and all the different types of surveys that people get are, I think, marked. And I think these are things that the regulator will look to change as we move forward and make sure that we're getting a good blend of both channel and times. And as we're hurtling towards this deadline, the other thing that we're hearing a lot is people have stopped talking about the submission itself, and people are starting to think about, right, how do we improve? And specifically, everybody's working with tight budgets. Everybody has a smaller team and less time than they would like. The question that they get asked most is, what are the specific activities that will move the needle the most on both our tenant satisfaction itself and the TSM scores? And we think that's a very fair question. And we hope that will help you work out how to answer that question today. So that's the preamble. Without further ado, I'm going to move on to Jonathan. I hope I've introduced him and we don't need to do that. I've definitely trailed the ostrich, so we don't need to do that. So Jonathan, please pick this up from latest TSM results, and thank you again for being with us.
Thanks, Pete. And you know what? That's probably the kindest intro I've ever had on a call. So thank you. I was blushing for those who could see my face. So thank you for having me along. It's a real honor. One of the really exciting things we've got at Housemark at the moment is we've collected that final TSM data for around about 240 landlords. And so some of the findings that I'm going to share with you today are based on that. If you submitted your data to us, thanks ever so much. It really helps add to the insight. There is a bit of a caveat to that in that we are limbering up a big old report release, press release, all lined up for the conference in Manchester, Housing 2024 next week. So if you are going to Manchester, there'll be lots more detail there released, hopefully with a big splash. And you can come and find me at the Housemark stand if you want to talk more. So I'm sharing some hot off the press initial findings with you today, albeit not the detail because that's under embargo for the moment. It's worth reminding people that TSMs are not just about perception metrics. So of course, within the TSM suite, you've got 22 indicators and 12 of them are based on your satisfaction surveys. But don't forget those 10 management information indicators as well. They'll be part of the analysis that we release at Housing 2024. But for today's session, I'm just focusing on those perception metrics. We have got all sorts of information on survey biases, if you like, which Pete alluded to in the intro. Those are primarily based from our mid-year reports. So we carried out a quick fire benchmarking exercise as at the end of September. We had over 200 landlords take part. We collected things like collection method and a lot of other information that helped us provide that insight into survey biases. But as Pete rightly said, there's been a lot of talk about the numbers, and the numbers aren't the most interesting thing really when it comes to customer experience. It's what you do with the data that's interesting. Remember that the bigger picture requires some wider analysis, and this is just a snapshot of the sorts of things we're seeing in the sector. It's a really challenging environment. So just in terms of costs, your finance directors will be weeping because the average landlord is spending £1,000 more per property than they were just 2 years ago. Massive requirements on investment, not just around improving the customer experience and new regulatory requirements, but in particular around building safety, around net zero. There's huge demands on money, And of course, margins, if you're a housing association, you'll be familiar with operating margins. They've been really squeezed. So finances are tight. On top of that, we've seen significant staff turnover in recent years. Over that same period, it was up 40%. We track that information monthly, and staff turnover has actually stabilized now, and in fact is slightly below pre-pandemic levels now. People are staying put, but landlords have really experienced a significant amount of turnover over the past couple of years. Arrears have gone up, and of course, with a 53-week year this year, there's lots of worry that they may go up further at the end of the year. One thing that's really interesting and really quite eye-watering from a customer experience perspective is what we've seen in contact centers. So we've seen a quadrupling of call wait times over that period. The average caller is now waiting 250 seconds for their call to be answered. For large HAs, it's even longer. It's 350 for large HAs. And that compares to something like 50 seconds about 2 years ago. We've seen those relet times increasing. Relet times is a bit of a lag indicator, but this is to say that lots of landlords are struggling with a backlog of voids that they're trying to let. We've seen complaints volumes go up. Some of this is about the new Housing Ombudsman Code and landlords logging informal complaints as they should now in line with the new code, but some of it is genuinely down to service pressures. We've seen that 50% increase in repair wait times as well. And with all of that bigger picture, is it any surprise that we've seen average tenant satisfaction drop down 10 percentage points in 2 years? So this really sets the context. It's really important to understand your results in context and the fact that the sector is undergoing a lot of challenges. I will say that, I've been working in the sector 20 years and I've never seen quite such challenging figures across almost all areas of operations. Happy for you to jump forward, Pete. Here's the big reveal almost. So this is what's been happening with overall satisfaction scores. What you might, for those of you who use codes, that's TP01 over the past 6 years. And you can see that it's a genuine decline. And at Housemark, prior to the TSMs, we had the STAR methodology, which was a voluntary methodology, but TP01 was carried out in exactly the same way. So this is consistent data, it's like for like, and it reflects a genuine decline in overall satisfaction. And in fact, this is across all the indicators. I've taken TP01 as the example. The figure itself, where you see those question marks, will be revealed at the conference, but your little sneak insight here is that it is down on the mid-year results that we collected as at the end of September. So we are talking about a challenging picture broadly. This is median, so this means that and it's what we call consistent cohort, so it's the same landlords, but it is down for the average landlord. I'll come on to the exception shortly. There's lots and lots and lots of talk about the scores. So, ultimately the regulator is going to publish these scores, we think around October, November time. So it'll all be out there in the open. And of course, naturally, your execs are a little bit looking at their scores. Most execs are disappointed with their scores, as you might imagine. And they're wondering how that's going to land with the press, with the public when those scores are released. So I can understand that concern. But really, at Housemark, we're interested in what it means for you as a landlord. We've identified 11 major variables in terms of what can influence those scores, and they're listed here. I won't go through them all in loads of detail, but on the very left, you've got contextual variables. This is the context you're operating in. There's nothing you can do about that. You've just got to understand it. In the middle, we've got methodological variables, which is how you carry out your survey and how that can impact your scores. And on the right, you've got the golden variables, which is what actually in terms of your how you operate and your performance is driving satisfaction. And the top 3 drivers, once you've stripped away all the context and methodology, are quick and easy contact resolution, how you engage with your residents, and of course, responsive repairs as the most common transaction a resident will have with you. I've got a few slides on just how that's illustrated. So here you've got satisfaction by landlord size and location. So smaller rural landlords are going to have a lot higher satisfaction on average than more larger and more urban landlords. You can see that London boroughs there have got the most challenging context in terms of a demographic. They're averaging, if the survey is a telephone survey, they're kind of averaging at 55 percentage points. So that's quite a challenging figure for them. But this highlights the importance of looking at context. Remember that London boroughs have got significant challenges around costs. Their residents have got challenges around cost of living, overcrowding. They've got significantly more high-rise units. You can start to see the sorts of things that will impact on those scores. Another contextual variable is tenure type. So for landlords with over 1,000 shared ownership units, you have to report your shared ownership figures, and they are significantly lower than general needs tenants. And leaseholders, which is not regulatory, but a lot of landlords are surveying their leaseholders anyway to get the insight, is lower again. Typically, we see shared owners 10 percentage points less satisfied than general needs residents, and leaseholders 10 percentage points less satisfied again. So as you can imagine, think of that in the contextual variables. We've seen leaseholder satisfaction in London in the teens. You know, these can really hit on your scores. Tenant age is another variable. So it's the inverted bell curve. Typically, the 35 to 45 bracket is the least satisfied. So I'm looking forward to next year when I should become statistically more satisfied. Life can only get better. See if you can guess my age. And then finally, another variable, this is the methodological variable. Have you zipped on, Pete? That's the one. So there are 4 main methods that landlords deploy to collect the surveys. You can see that landlords that deploy a face-to-face survey, going around chapping on doors, get significantly better results on average than telephone or postal surveys, which again perform better than online surveys. So for landlords that have done online surveys, what's driving it? People often say, is it because younger people are more likely to fill in online surveys? Well, it's not really that. It's really about self-selection. If you send out a link and someone's not happy with you, they're much more likely to click on the link and hammer out on the keyboard than someone who is broadly ambivalent. But all of that, whilst it's interesting, is not really important. So what I want to do is introduce you to the ostrich. And I've met a lot of ostriches over the past few months or even years. And an ostrich is an acronym that I came up with. I'm quite proud of it. You can imagine it was an afternoon well spent. The acronym stands for obsessing with scores and targets rather than improving customer happiness. I was so pleased when I came up with that. I was like, genius. So what are ostrich behaviors? So think about what an ostrich does. Ostriches strut around the place. So certainly prior to regulation, I saw quite a few ostriches strutting around saying, oh, you know, our satisfaction score is really, really good, but not really understanding how it was achieved. Prior to regulation, a lot of landlords, particularly larger HAs, would report transactional results in their annual reports, which typically do give higher satisfaction scores. And really, that was one of the drivers for regulation. When the department and the regulator were doing their roundtables, a lot of residents were saying, the landlord reports really high satisfaction, but I'm not satisfied. Neighbor down the road's not satisfied. Neighbor up the road's not satisfied. Who are these 96% satisfied? So there was a bit of strutting going on, which is one of the reasons why this consistent framework was brought in. However, less strutting these days and more flapping. So you think about those landlords who were used to at a senior level seeing quite good satisfaction results, and then the TSM survey results land and they're a lot lower than figures that they're used to seeing. So a bit of flapping going on, and really that you shouldn't flap. The results are all feedback is good, and it's really about what you do with the results rather than running around worrying about the score and how it ranks against someone else. And of course, ostriches famously put their head in the sand and ignore resident feedback when it doesn't fit the narrative of what they're seeing. And really, this is all about a maturity journey. If you've got an ostrich in the room, try and calm them down, no flapping, and really try and shift the debate away from the scores and into what you can do with the data to genuinely make improvements. And as Pete said earlier on the call, that's what the regulator's interested in right now. They're not interested in where you rank in the league table. And in fact, I've had lots of conversations with the regulator, and I'm convinced that they have a level of maturity around collection method and context that they will understand that. What they really want to see is what you're doing with the data. So is it just a regulatory requirement? Is it just a tick box exercise? It absolutely shouldn't be. It's an opportunity. Think about, customer experience people are absolutely delighted to get feedback. Typically, all feedback is good feedback, and you're mobilizing a massive exercise. You've got that investment to get loads of feedback. So really, it's a massive opportunity to get meaningful feedback to drive service improvement. And over the last 12 months, although the headline is a little bit dire about satisfaction coming down on average, what we've noticed is that 31% of landlords, just shy of a third, are improving their satisfaction scores over the last 12 months. And so really, that's where you want to be. You want to be in that third. You want to be kind of ahead of the curve, making the best use of your data to drive service improvement. And really, this time next year, hopefully, if you've made that shift onto the left-hand side, you're one of those landlords improving, then you'll have less flapping, fewer ostriches in the room. So to finish off, really, I wanted to share what we're seeing in terms of those 31% that are improving their scores, because this is what really matters. And I think the first thing we note is a level of maturity around analyzing the data. And that's why I'm so delighted to be sharing a platform with Wordnerds, because that's exactly what they do. They help you analyze your data and bring that level of maturity around the analysis. So that's one thing to definitely pick up on, is how you do that sentiment analysis, how you do that free text analysis. Now, I know that some landlords are not adding in open-ended questions because they feel like they can't process them, but really they are such a rich source of information for you. Other stuff that you can do with your data. So leading landlords are taking an integrated approach to feedback. So most landlords have typically had quite a fragmented approach. They've had the repairs team carrying out repairs surveys, the complaints team carrying out complaints surveys, and those approaches not bringing the data together and not really taking a consistent approach to maximize feedback and minimize survey fatigue. So an integrated approach to feedback. And a lot of landlords have moved to rolling perception surveys. So they've got sort of regular results coming in that they can act on quickly. That is a trend. Certainly, larger landlords that haven't yet done that certainly mostly have an aspiration to do so when they're ready. Housemark, we also do, we collect staffing structures every year, and the latest data we're coming in is seeing a big increase in dedicated CX staff within the sector. And that's really important. We definitely note an improvement when you've got that resource, that specialism around CX, taking a kind of strategic company-wide approach, employing best practice when it comes to feedback analysis. And then also on that analysis, make sure you're doing your gap analysis. This is something that Housemark's very strong at. So look at your different TSMs and look at where the gap is compared to your similar peers. So if you're kind of like 4 percentage points below the average on overall satisfaction, but more on the repairs ones and less on the more cultural metrics, that gives you an idea of where some of your weaknesses might be. I'm a little bit worried about time, Pete, so I won't focus too much on these other three columns, but it's just to note that actually improving the customer experiences is a lot more than the data analysis from the TSM surveys. Lots of work around customer engagement going on, and it's important to note that consultation is out and co-design is in. You know, back in the day, people would come up with proposed policies and put them in front of a residents panel for them to rubber stamp. That's not what leading landlords are doing now. They're looking at co-design, getting residents in right at the start, looking at customer segmentation, proactive communication. So we've seen upticks in the perception around safety, where landlords have been really out there communicating what they're doing around building safety. Taking that multi-channel approach and joining up the boots on the ground, going, we've got interactions with our residents going on all over the place. How can we turn this into a consistent narrative? How can we maximize all those interactions? Lots of landlords looking at their target operating model. So we've noticed a lot of landlords bringing maintenance services in-house in particular, or looking to bring maintenance services in-house, employing more housing officers to reduce those patch sizes, because feedback from surveys quite often highlights that residents want more visibility, they want more contact with their housing officers. The specialist ASB teams are back. So we've seen an uptick in the number of specialist ASB staff. That area had been seen as kind of more optional, as landlords kind of were regulated primarily on finances over the past 10 years. So we'd seen a kind of scaling back of specialist ASB teams. They're definitely back, but it's all about lean service design. Imagine those cost figures I showed you at the beginning. Landlords really have to make sure they're improving the customer experience, but doing it for less money. So that's minimizing handoffs. Staff retention as well is a big focus with employee value propositions. If you can't pay your staff more, can you provide value in other ways, and lots of focus around cultural change as well. One thing to note, if you're looking at your contact center figures and going, oh crumbs, that rings true for us. We've got really long wait times in our contact center. Remember that staff in the contact center are often not very well paid. They often have to log on to a multiple different systems to service a tenant's request. And so someone who's only been in the role 2 weeks, 4 weeks is really not going to be able to work as quickly as someone with more experience. So what we've seen is better paid staff in contact centers does reap dividends in terms of lower turnover in that business area. Lots of work around data strategy, landlords focusing on integration, governance, running automated reports on data quality, quite often using software, real-time dashboards, often in Power BI, working on forecasting demands, when is this boiler going to break down, and taking a really tailored approach to their residents, kind of understanding the customer segment that they're in, their communication preferences, and so on. So I know that was a whistle-stop tour. I'm happy to take questions. I've seen some questions come in, Pete, so I'm hoping you will point them in my direction if that's appropriate. But for now, I will hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jonathan. That was really, really good. I think so much of that really mirrors our approach as well. I think one of the reasons why we were keen to get you on is we really love the work that Housemark does, and it definitely fits into lots of the things that you said there resonate with us. And I'm sure that Helen's going to pick some of these themes up in her piece, which I think moves on very nicely from it. I know there's some questions coming in. Thank you, Nat. Please do keep them coming. I think what we'll try and do is we'll whistle through, I think there's 5 or 6 slides from Helen, which kind of build on the story that Jonathan's been talking about. And I do hope you enjoy your 21st birthday next year, Jonathan, as well. Maths was never my strong point.
You're too kind.
Helen, do you want to pick it up from the springboard that Jonathan's given you, and then we'll pick up Nat's question at the end and add some more to it then?
Sounds great. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, super interesting. Always good to kind of see what's happening from a wider sector perspective. So I thought we'd talk today a little bit around how we help our clients to essentially build their own improvement plans. But first of all, obviously, just to cover on the statistics of this first, obviously we have our TSM scores. For those of you who might have been living under a rock, it might be worth just covering off. Obviously, the TSM score works very much like the CSAT scoring. So we're looking at the percentage of very satisfied and fairly satisfied responses across your total responses. There's some interesting nuances within this, particularly when we're looking at improving TSM scores and outcomes for residents. In particular, this particular equation, it obviously doesn't support neutral or unhappy answers in a lot of ways. It also arguably, when you are looking to kind of improve your TSM score, if that is something that that is happening within a conversation that's happening within your organisation, the easiest way to improve this score is actually to focus on your passive group, not your detractor groups, because these are the closest to moving into promoters, so you're satisfied and fairly satisfied. That strategy doesn't necessarily work so well for the outcomes of improving the lives of your tenants as a whole. So really we would still encourage you to certainly look at the extremities of these two scoring groups. The very, very happy, what makes you, what are you doing well, how can you replicate this, but also what are you doing really badly and how can you start to kind of really move those issues around, so that actually you've got fewer people in that really detractor group and moving into the passives group, and ultimately moving those passives into promoters. So today we are going to cover off a little bit of a framework for how you can build your improvement plans. It starts with, no surprises, the drivers of your satisfaction. And very much we're focusing on how we use text feedback in order to help understand drivers. We do not stop at the scores. The reason for that is knowing that you've got 72% satisfaction isn't very helpful for anyone in your organisation. Really, we need to understand what's driving that satisfaction. That information lives in your customer feedback. That can be in your survey responses, it can be in your complaints, it can be in the one-to-one conversations that you're having on the ground with tenants, but you need a way of capturing this information and looking at it. As Jonathan very rightly pointed out, there is context to this, to your drivers of satisfaction analysis. So anyone who's doing a good driver of satisfaction analysis will come up with multiple issues, and hopefully you'll be able to size those and ultimately bring in some sentiment to that as well, so that you can see not only what people are talking about the most, but also what's driving sentiment across those. But ultimately we need to be able to benchmark this, both bring the internal context, are these issues affecting everyone, as well as the external context, where are you doing well compared to the sector, where ultimately is that gap analysis happening, where are the gaps that you might need to prioritise. And ultimately, in doing all of this, that does give you a level through which we can help you to prioritise the insight, make the most impact for your tenants in the shortest amount of time in the first instance, but also what big things are going to make, are really going to move the dial for tenants and ultimately your scores. How do you design an action plan, hopefully co-created with your customers in mind? And then ultimately, and possibly most importantly, that often gets missed, is when you're delivering these improvements, are you monitoring those improvements? Are you coming back round and checking that they are making a difference? At this point, I think we've got a poll, hopefully. So ultimately, what are your main areas of concern in having already submitted your TSMs, looking at how you build your improvements? If you can pop your answers in, I think we will crack on whilst the poll's going on. But yeah, please do give us a shout if there's anything else that we haven't mentioned in our poll that you think we might have missed. Please drop that in the chat as well. I think really useful to get your thoughts on what might be a concern. So let's start with how we start a driver analysis. So here's an example of should say at the start of this, all the data we're about to show you is dummy data. There is no customer data involved in this, particularly for the customers that are on the call. Don't worry, we're not naming and shaming here. So essentially an example of what your TSM scores might look like. We are really interested in understanding how we can benchmark this against previous years as well, so you can start to understand what might be getting better and what might be getting worse. As I say, though, these numbers on their own are not helpful. Knowing that repairs services are down year on year is no good for your repairs team. And knowing that maybe your complaints handling process has slightly improved year on year, again, not very helpful for your customer teams either. We need a lot more information, but this provides us with a starting point, and it certainly gives us areas to start focusing in on when we go into to prioritize the data. Our preferred method of understanding a driver's analysis essentially is a way of coding up your data to get to the reasons why issues are issues. There are multiple ways that you can do this. Root cause analysis it is a common one, and ultimately the aim here is to start with some top level ideas. The TSMs obviously give you some great categories to kind of build on. Lots of people will be doing this manually, so dots and dashing to kind of read through all of your survey results. I feel your pain if you are in that, if you're in that particular group. Ultimately, when Wordnerds does this, we're completely automating that process, so that essentially, based using our AI classifications that we've built with our customers, we're able to essentially code up the data so that in the first instance, we understand how many comments relating to the TSMs occur within each of the TSM categories. And then within each of those drivers, we then want to break it down. So what we've got here is an example of a TSM framework that Wordnerds uses, looking at, for example, repair visits being the most talked about category within this particular dummy data set. Although hopefully that will resonate with a lot of your data sets, repairs and communication being two of the most talked about points in most people's data, to be honest. Again, knowing that repairs are the most talked about and that they have a relatively negative sentiment score in this instance isn't that helpful. We still need to get under the skin of the repairs. So essentially what we're doing then is going a level down. So within repairs visits, what are customers talking about? And you can see the top 5 things that people are talking about there include contractors, wait times, the quality of the work when it's being done, the security of the property, the maintenance and the checks and the processes that go into it. So it gives us a starting point to start looking at, okay, we know that we've got some negativity here, and also here are our top 5 most talked about things. Again, volume and sentiment are a really good way of being able to understand particularly where you might want to start thinking about honing your efforts and your improvements. You'll notice as well partway down though that damage in the property is an exceptionally negative topic, and again we may want to bring some of these things forward even though they aren't the most talked about, and that's where sentiment can really give you a lens through which to look at this data. Again though, knowing that contractors is the most talked about subcategory within repair visits isn't helpful. We still need to get to a level of detail within your analysis that gives you some clear actions to go away with and start recommending. In our platform, all of this stuff is clickable. So what you can see here is a little thread going from, we've got X number of people talking about repair visits, moving into the biggest talking point being contractors. Within that, some of the topics that we're able to pick out, again, using AI algorithms, is damage to the property, and we've got the verbatim that goes along with it. It tells a really nice story for your repairs colleagues to start looking at actually where might there be issues with repairs. What we'd probably recommend that you do next is also look at the different types of job that is happening here where damage is being talked about, so you can see those correlations. And often we find at this stage, there might be a specific contractor or a particular type of job that might be causing more correlation with damage reports than others. The next thing obviously is, once we've got this list of issues, is to start thinking about the metadata and the benchmarking that Jonathan talked about earlier and actually covered in quite a lot of detail, and I think we definitely recommend. I guess my question is, when is an issue an issue, and are all issues affecting all customers equally? And the answer 99.9% of the time is no. These are not issues that are affecting all of your residents equally. And so ultimately, what we want to start doing is bringing in what we class as metadata into the analysis. So your metadata is it's the additional information that you're collecting alongside your survey responses, your complaints data. Ultimately, the typical ones, the most useful ones, are things like what neighborhood they belong to, what property type they reside in, what sort of tenant they are from a demographic perspective, and equally lots and lots of others that that might be useful in order to start understanding these issues. Are they affecting a particular group of people in more ways? Here's an example that we've included for damp and mold. So in this instance, we've got 160 instances within this data set of damp and mold being reported. When we break that down by neighborhood, in this instance we've just gone west, north, east and south. You will have much better data than we do. Ultimately, what we can see straight away is that actually nearly 2/3 of the damp and mold cases are occurring in the south. That might therefore give us a reason to start thinking about focusing and prioritizing effort into this particular region. So that's what we mean by bringing that internal metadata into the discussion and the improvement processes. Similarly, from a benchmarking perspective, what issues are actually driving more concern from a sector-wide perspective? So if you're looking at actually our complaints data isn't great, but we're performing better than most in the sector, it might therefore be a reason to park your complaints processes and start looking at something where you might be underperforming. We have a ton of information on analyzing data at this level in an insight report, in an insight webinar that we produced a few months back. So what we'll do is we'll also include a link to that webinar for anyone who's interested in really getting an understanding of how you do a good root cause analysis and some other analysis frameworks in order to get down to that level of action and detail that you need to help bring your data to life. At this point, the third step is prioritizing insight, and Pete's going to talk about some of the methods that you can use to help prioritize your insight.
Thanks, Helen. I see what you did there with the benchmarking picture. Very clever. I love a bit of a dingbat in there. So well done on that one. I'm going to be really quick, so I want to leave as much time as possible for questions, but there's a couple of slides that we want to go through just talking about the implementation. Really interesting that in the poll, it looks like nearly half of you, the biggest issue that you're facing now that your TSMs are in is the actual service improvement and monitoring side of things. So people feel like they're generally getting there with the data side of things, but there are still significant numbers of people who have issues, 16% with prioritizing insight, 14% with designing an action plans. I think these three next steps are well worth covering because nearly 2/3 of you fit into one of those three categories. In terms of prioritizing insight, there's a few different things you could do. We're always very keen to explain that data literacy is a journey and everybody starts from a different point and everybody is at a different stage. And it doesn't matter where you are, there are some very easy first steps that you can make. And there are some amazing people out there that are doing brilliant things. So one simple first step, when you've got your list of drivers that Helen spoke about, and you've got sentiment scores and you've got volumes, is just to plot those on a simple quadrant graph, like on the left-hand side. So on the left-hand side, you can see helpful staff is high in sentiment, high in volumes. That's obviously great. You don't have to worry about that. You can do some learning from there. Call wait times, on the other hand, are high in volume and low in sentiment. That's obviously a problem. You need to prioritize that. That's pretty straightforward. It is clearly a blunt tool. If you take something like damp and mold, as we all know, that tends to be very low volume and very low sentiment. It's not going to be the thing that moves your TSM score the highest, but actually, as we all know, the importance of dealing with those quickly and efficiently is huge because of the potential issues that can go along with it. So statistics help, but they are they're only statistics, and you always need a human to interpret them and decide on the next action and decide on the priority. We have done, and again, we'll put the link in the care package that we send you all afterwards. We did a webinar a couple of months ago with Chris from Guinness, who's on this call, Chris Haynes. And I think of all the people we work with, Chris is definitely one of the most advanced. Jonathan spoke about Power BI and how more and more housing associations are looking to report their customer data real time in Power BI. Chris does an amazing job of that. And he's taking some fairly well-worn statistical methodologies like regression analysis. We can produce a list of what your data is telling you that people are talking about, the topics, the themes, the sentiment scores, but not all of those are created equally. There's been some chat there about actually things like customer effort. Jonathan spoke about there are some things that you can change, some things that you can't change, and there are kind of golden issues that are the ones that the biggest levers for you that tend to affect satisfaction the most. And actually, what regression analysis is a way of looking at two things and seeing whether they have a positive or a negative relationship, or whether they just happen to be kind of bumbling alongside each other. Why is that important? You can look at all of your drivers, you can compare them to something like satisfaction, either at a category level or an overall level, and you can look at statistically what are the things that are actually driving that satisfaction up and down. And that is huge, because there are any number of things that people talk about that actually they don't really care about, and there are usually a very small number of things that make a huge difference. It can also uncover things that you didn't know about. So one of the stories that Chris tells in the webinar, which really resonated with me, was they had a small issue across their portfolio with damp and mold. They looked at the data and they looked at people who were talking about damp and mold to see what other things that they were talking about. And they ran some regression analysis on that. And they found a lot of people talking about ivy and climbing plants. And when they did the stats on it, there was a causal relationship, or a positive relationship, I should say, between climbing plants and ivy and damp and mold. So the more people had climbing plants and ivy on the outside of their building, the more likely they were to have damp and mold issues. Clearly, there's an obvious action there. Send a grounds team around, trim the ivy, trim the climbing plants, and damp and mold should go down. And things like that you wouldn't have known about if you weren't able to do a basic level of statistical analysis. So there's some really kind of accessible things that people can do. Regression analysis is something that you can do in Excel. It's not difficult these days. I urge anybody to either get in touch with us or reach out to Chris. There are a bunch of people doing some great stuff here. And in our experience in this sector, people are often very happy to share best practice, which is one of the reasons we love working here. One thing that a lot of people are doing with TSMs, I think Jonathan made very eloquently the case for, even though it is about tenant satisfaction as a whole, clearly people do care about the scores. There will be an external reaction to this from press and elsewhere, and it is important that we get those scores up. So one simple place to start is, what are the issues that are impacting more than one of the TSM categories that Helen had up on that graph at the top? And let's at least look at the things that you can solve or improve that have the biggest footprint across most of the things that the regulator tells you that they care about. Hopefully we'll be able to share more information on that in due course, but I know the people that we know are doing some great work on this aren't ready to share that quite yet. So there's some simple stuff you can do, there's some more advanced stuff you can do, but do look at the data and look at different ways to prioritize those. We can help you with that. I'll touch on this very quickly because I think Jonathan covered it eloquently. One of the things that TSMs is very clear on is the requirement to communicate often with your residents. And people have for a long time had resident advisory boards, newsletters that go out. You said we did meetings. There are a bunch of ways that people can get out in front of their customers. That's well worn now and something that people do. You don't need us to tell you how to do that. What we find, however, is that, this really, really does resonate with a point that kind of Jonathan made around, this isn't consultation, this is co-creation, and what's the difference? We did a cheat code for voice of customer webinar with a company called Clarisis. They're a London-based consultancy that specialize in customer experience. Again, we will share this. And Tom from Clarisis presented this amazing methodology that takes an agile approach to the delivery of an improvement roadmap. What does that mean? I think historically we've all been guilty of looking at our customer data and going, okay, these are the big issues that we've got. Let's then go and solve this issue for our customers. Oh, we've designed this brilliant thing. Let's implement that and then have a meeting to tell people what we've done. The problem with that approach is that no project, no piece of software, no idea that any sort of small group of people ever creates survives its first interaction with actual human beings completely intact. There is always the law of unintended consequences. You've always misread something in the data. Maybe you thought that the reason they had the problem was X and the reason was Y. And people are different. Your customers, your residents aren't a homogenous group of people. I know you know this. People have different needs, and you will never be able to design off the bat something that keeps everybody happy. Clarisys are very, very good at helping people design delivery plans that start with really great analysis, involve residents in co-creating the solutions to those, and then thinking about, right, what's the smallest way we can trial this in a really small area? So to Helen's point, let's pick out a particular part of your customer base where this is a big problem. Let's do a pilot. Let's learn from that, get feedback, move to a slightly bigger area, and iterate on this in an agile way that software developers have been doing for years and years, but isn't often seen in large customer improvement projects. It's a great insight into how to do this differently, and we'll share that as well. I'm very conscious of time, so Helen, I'm going to hand over to you and hope we can whistle through this next bit while everybody's getting their questions in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Yeah, if I can shamelessly plug Wordnerds for a little bit, just whilst everyone's getting their questions in. So we often get asked on these webinars how Wordnerds is supporting other housing providers. And ultimately, I thought I'd just bring together a little slide which explains it. Obviously, we've got some customers on the call as well who can probably do this far more eloquently than I can. But ultimately, what we're trying to do here is bring all of your verbatim together and analyze it consistently. To touch on some of the things that Jonathan's just described, really what we want to be doing is making sure that no voices are missed across your data sets. So all of your surveys, all of your complaints data, anything from the contact center, web chats, repairs, systems, etc. We ultimately want to be able to bring this information in and start to use it to understand where there are issues with service. And ultimately, we also want to take the pain away from any kind of manual coding that might be happening within your organization. Classification done through AI is far better than having someone manually trawl through this stuff. Not only from an accuracy perspective, it is actually more accurate to use tools for this rather than human beings, because we come with levels of our own bias, and we just can't be consistent like tools can be. Ultimately, though, the aim of this is to understand drivers of where are your complaints coming from, what's driving that tenant satisfaction score, or any of your other satisfaction scores and pieces of feedback. What's driving those interactions? How can you improve them? Today, we are offering a TSM improvement report. I can see a bunch of you are still focused on understanding drivers of tenant satisfaction from the data that you've got. If you're in that boat, we have got a TSM improvement report. It costs £5,100 to give us the data. We will upload it for you. We will process it. We'll analyze it, and we'll give you a report which looks something like some of these slides, essentially with recommendations for where you should think about prioritizing improvements based on the data that we have. And we'll also present the findings in a webinar for your stakeholders as well. If that's something of interest, obviously do get in touch with either Pete or myself, and I'm more than happy to talk you through that process in the first instance, and see what your data looks like. before we get to the Q&A, just a quick thank you very much for your attendance. In the care package that we send out after this, you'll get today's slides and today's recording. We'll send you links to the webinars that we've referenced, the Insight webinar, the cheat code webinar for Voice of Customer. That one will be particularly useful for anyone interested in service improvement and monitoring. Clarisis really are the experts in the world of CX, and Tom's session on that webinar was brilliant. An example TSM report, you can use it to base your own version off or get us to do a version for you. And we've also got some information around our AI classifications in the TSM theme bank, so we'll send that through. And finally, Jonathan and Pete are talking on stage next week at Housing 2024, which is not to be missed. If you don't have tickets yet, we do have links that we can send around so you can register for free tickets, and I'm sure Jonathan can probably do the same. We'll pop something in either the chat or in the email afterwards so that you can get tickets if you're in and around Manchester tomorrow from Tuesday to Thursday, I think it's on. So hopefully all of that is helpful. And I will pass back to Pete at this point for questions.
Yeah, too much great content, not enough time. But I think there was a question there from Nat that we can pick up. I'm just looking for it now. I know it was around the difference between perception and transaction, which I think is something that comes up quite a lot. So we're seeing a difference between transactional survey satisfaction and TSM satisfaction. Are there any tips to influence perception in a world where we know tenants aren't necessarily experiencing all services? Jonathan, I'd love to get your take on this.
So both types of survey have their uses, in my view. So although the regulatory survey's perception, most landlords will and should be collecting transactional results. Now, transactional results typically land about 15 percentage points higher than your perception survey results. So it's really important internally that your key stakeholders know the difference. I personally don't recommend transactional results for governance purposes because people will just ask questions, but they are really good for reactive service improvement, spotting issues as they come in. We normally see when there is transformation going on, we see the transactional results improve much more quickly than the perception results. Our analysis suggests that anything you do now will actually only start to meaningfully shift perception in 18 months' time. That's the usual lag between transaction and perception upticking. Does that answer the question, Pete?
Yeah, brilliant and beautifully concise. Thank you. I know we're at time. There's one more thing that came up in the chat that I'd love to reference, and it's the conversation around effort and how we can focus in on effort in the customer experience. Helen, we're big fans at Wordnerds of Matthew Dixon's Effortless Experience book, and I know that with some of our retail customers, we've built theme banks that look at effort as a thing and actually putting a score on effort. Is there anything you want to kind of mention there?
Am I on mute? No, sorry. Not necessarily, just that book's great if you haven't read it. For any customer experience professional, I think it's a brilliant one, which kind of focuses more on customer experience, isn't the way to customer happiness effort is, or effortless experiences are. And I think clearly there's a lot of crossover there with what we're seeing in the data and what people expect. So yeah, definitely worth a read. And I know Nat's got some really good AI classifications looking at effort, how you can sort of expose effort in your data set. So customers in particular, if you're interested in that, speak to your CSM.
Indeed, and this idea that people don't want to be delighted, they just want the basics done really well. To
Yeah.
which we are at time, and everybody has other things to do, and I'm going to let you all go because otherwise I will not be giving you the effortless experience. So all that remains to be said is, firstly, thank you, Jonathan. Really appreciate the effort that you made to get on here. Really well worth you coming from our perspective. Love the work that you guys do, and I shall look forward to seeing you in Manchester next week. Helen, thank you so much as well, as ever, really insightful. Thank you to everybody who's turned up again. We don't take it for granted that you guys keep coming back to these things, and we love learning from you and sharing those learnings. And thanks to everybody behind the scenes, Kelton and the team, for making this happen. Really appreciate it. Have a lovely rest of the week. And great to see so many of you again. Thank you.